Tonight, back to work. Lawmakers return to Capitol Hill to face a fight over government funding, plus religious freedom on the line in Iran, and the First Amendment under attack.
If you can deny citizens the opportunity to hear the truth, to challenge falsehood and lies, you can imprison people.
The constitutional protections for even the most vile speech.
Even though we live in dangerous times, we have a constitution designed for bad times.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. An official impeachment inquiry welcomes House lawmakers returning from recess. Good evening in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has approved an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. It has to do with Biden's potential role in his son Hunter's business deals. And it jumpstarts a busy month for lawmakers. Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka is on Capitol Hill with details on the inquiry and the other big agenda item, a potential government shutdown. Matt?
Yeah, Jenna, summer is indeed over here on Capitol Hill, and it's time to get back to work. And Speaker McCarthy's announcement today could be viewed as a way to get some Republicans on board to deal with this month's other big issue, avoiding that potential government shutdown.
These are allegations of abuse of power, obstruction, and corruption, and they warrant further investigation by the House of Representatives.
McCarthy called on committee heads to formally start the process of moving toward a potential impeachment vote for President Joe Biden. Republicans have been trying to make the case that Biden used his power as then vice president to influence business deals for his son Hunter.
The American people deserve to know that the public offices are not for sale, and that the federal government is not being used to cover up the actions of a politically associated family.
While no hard evidence has been produced so far by the House Oversight Committee, Republicans say it could come out in the inquiry.
I do expect them to open an inquiry for no other reason but to try to get a little more cooperation in terms of getting the facts. And if they decide to do that, I'll be supportive.
If you're going to impeach a president, you should have an inquiry vote. The Democrats didn't do that. But I think the way to make an inquiry legitimate is to have a vote as to whether or not you should have one at all, rather than just the leadership deciding.
Speaker McCarthy vowed to call a floor vote if it gets to that point. This is all happening while Congress faces an end-of-month deadline to continue funding the government or face a possible shutdown. Some Republicans want tighter border security and to gash parts of the Justice Department. There's also a debate over whether Ukraine aid should be included in that new funding bill. The Speaker's impeachment inquiry could be a way to mend fences with House Republicans, pushing McCarthy to not give any ground to Democrats. Florida's Matt Gaetz threatened to call for removing McCarthy, even after the impeachment inquiry announcement.
I rise today to serve notice. Mr. Speaker, you are out of compliance with the agreement that allowed you to assume this role. The path forward for the House of Representatives is to either bring you into immediate, total compliance or remove you pursuant to a motion to vacate the chair.
And Gaetz said he's prepared to call multiple votes if McCarthy and leadership do indeed push for a continuing resolution or a CR, basically a Band-Aid funding bill that would keep government open for the next month and keep those funding debates open for the next month. Jenna?
Yeah, kick the can down the road. Matt, many critics of McCarthy were quick to point out what they see as hypocrisy on the Speaker's part after today's announcement. Why is that?
Well, this all goes back to 2019 and the first impeachment of then-President Donald Trump. Then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called for that inquiry without taking a House vote. Kevin McCarthy at the time was very critical of Pelosi, and now people are accusing him of doing the same thing now. But again, he did vow to take the vote to the floor if it gets to that point. And you even have some other Republicans who spoke to we heard from Senator Lindsey Graham in that story, who are saying a vote would make this inquiry more legitimate. It seems like it would go that direction if it does get that far.
All right, Matt Galka on Capitol Hill for us. Thank you, Matt. Romina Bocha is the Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute, and she joins us now for more. Romina, welcome. So, we, of course, have been here before, and it always seems like lawmakers squeak out a deal at the last minute or come up with some sort of continuing resolution. How concerned are you about a possible government shutdown?
I think it looks more likely this time than in previous years, but we also have to keep in mind that Congress is looking at a federal election next year, so a government shutdown may not look good for either side. I think the most likely scenario is a continuing resolution sometime into the fall, perhaps into mid-December, under the guise of avoiding a so-called Christmas tree bill. The omnibus that we saw late last year was such an approach, but in the end, it's very difficult to get lawmakers to vote for these spending bills because they are chock full of waste, they're full of earmarks, and the spending levels, at least on the Senate bills that are being passed now, are far too high, in excess of agreed upon spending limits in this last debt limit deal. So there's a lot for lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to dislike, and usually to get them to pass that final funding bill, it takes a lot of pressure, like missing Christmas. That's my prediction.
Yeah, that'll put some pressure on them for sure. Romina, what do you see as some of the biggest sticking points for the two sides this time around?
I think this is one of the issues, that there are several. One of them is the emergency supplemental that President Biden has asked for. The talks are now of attaching that to that continuing resolution. President Biden has asked for more than $40 billion in additional funding that would be in addition to the spending limits that Congress agreed to just back in June when they raised the debt limit. And a lot of members are wary of raising spending so soon again at a time when we have still such high inflation, heightened interest rates, and deficits that are looking to reach about $2 trillion next year. Those are crisis time deficits that we expect to reach during peacetime. So I think it is right for lawmakers to keep the longer term debt picture in mind and the unsustainability of federal spending and say, the buck stops here. We will not authorize additional spending. If Ukraine aid, disaster assistance, and other aid is necessary, then Congress should find the money within its allotted budget, not top it off.
Yeah, Romina, do you see any areas where compromise might be possible?
Compromise is certainly possible. The question is, will it be in favor of the American people, or will it be Congress as operating as usual by kicking the can down the road? That is my biggest fear, and I think this is where we're heading towards. Some other issues that are in the mix are Republicans are asking for more border security funding. Republicans, particularly in the Senate, are plussing up spending bills with more emergency spending that's not really for emergencies, but would fund things like salaries for certain federal government agencies and other items that should just be part of regular operations. But in the end, Congress will have to come to some sort of agreement, because these discretionary spending bills do have to pass every year, or that federal funding will cease, and then the government will have to undergo a partial government shutdown. Those tend to not last very long. So the question this time is, what can members hope to gain from going into a shutdown? Will they strengthen their negotiating hand or not? And if not, then is it more theatrics than actual substance? I wish that lawmakers would focus more on addressing the major drivers of our debt crises. Those are the entitlement programs, particularly Medicare and Social Security, but those have been pretty much off the table.
All right, Romina Bocha with the Cato Institute, thank you for coming on this evening. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, turning overseas, nearly 3,000 people are now confirmed dead following the catastrophic earthquake in Morocco. And tonight, a race against time to find any survivors still among the rubble. The government says thousands are still missing, many of which are buried under collapsed buildings. And for those who have survived, the road ahead is long. For now, the focus is on finding food, water, and shelter. CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell brings us the latest from Marrakesh.
Within hours of the earthquake, Operation Blessing's Diego Traverso and his team were on the ground, distributing blankets, food, and bread to those left devastated by the earthquake.
Destruction is visible. You see that small towns are completely down, like 200 houses totally down, a couple mosques only stand up.
Traverso and his Operation Blessing team are back here in Marrakesh, getting more supplies to take to the villages in the mountains devastated by the earthquake.
Right now we are doing an assessment. We're trying to visit as many villages as we can to see how we can help long and midterm. Right now we're buying some purchases. We're working with the local church.
Traverso says the disaster is an opportunity to share the love of God.
We want to be the light. We want to be the hands of mercy of Jesus in this place. We need favor with the locals. We need more context, and we need access too to get farther on the villages. There is a lot of needs. We need a lot of favor. We need miracles happening, which is exciting because we know that God is in action, is in move, and we want to be part of it.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, on the ground in Marrakesh, Morocco, with Operation Blessing.
All right, thank you, Chris. Well, as one North African country reels from a devastating earthquake, another is facing the fallout of massive flooding. In Libya, at least 10,000 people are missing and thousands feared dead. A Mediterranean storm dumped historic amounts of rain, sending floodwaters that devastated neighborhoods and towns on the coast. The worst damage seen in Derma, which is inaccessible to relief and rescue workers. The Prime Minister of the region told news reporters the area has been declared a disaster zone, and he fears there could be as many as 2,000 people dead. Today, in a statement, President Biden said the U.S. is sending emergency funds to relief organizations and coordinating with the Libyan authorities and the UN to provide additional support. Human rights abuses in Iran, who Tehran is targeting, and what the U.S. can do to end it. Welcome back. Even as the U.S. moves to swap prisoners with Iran in a deal that would release 5 Americans, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, is out with a new report detailing human rights abuses and persecution in the Islamic Republic. In a new country update, USCIRF says the theocratic authoritarian state targets religious minorities and that the regime is responsible for state-perpetrated killings, imprisonment, torture, government-perpetrated rape and sexual violence, bodily injury, and enforced disappearances. Susie Gelman is with USCIRF, and she joins us now. Susie, welcome. So where does Iran rank on a list of worst offenders against religious freedom?
They're certainly at the top of the list, I would say. They have committed systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations particularly since the start of the protests almost a year ago. If you remember, September 16th last year, Mahsa Amini was basically killed by the authorities for not apparently being appropriately dressed in terms of wearing a hijab. And as we know, that murder set off unprecedented protests in Iran that have continued to this day. One of the things that we're already seeing in the lead up to the first anniversary of her murder is increased suppression. They're escalating religious freedom violations in Iran ahead of the one-year anniversary. They're continuing to target religious minorities and arresting peaceful protesters, as they have been doing for the entire year and beyond. I mean, we know they're an incredibly repressive regime. They are targeting, in particular, 2 religious minorities, each of which comprise less than 1% of the population. We're talking about members of the Baha'i faith as well as Christians in Iran. In particular, Baha'i Iranians have been arrested. 4 leaders have been rearrested. They're members of Yaran-e-Iran, which is Friends of Iran. So 7 Baha'i leaders have been imprisoned. They served a decade in prison, and 4 of them have been rearrested. Christians report that they're getting pressure from the government not to participate in protests. And if they do participate and they're arrested, they are sexually assaulted in prison.
Susie, I want to ask you about this. Yeah. While I have you, I want to ask you about this proposed deal that would free some $6 billion in frozen oil funds to aid the release of 5 Americans. What do you make of that?
So that is completely separate from religious freedom issues. And therefore, we don't think that there is a connection between the two. The $6 billion obviously has to do with releasing Iranian Americans who've been unjustifiably imprisoned by Iran. We think that the United States can do other things on the religious freedom issue to pressure Iran. So if I may just mention a few things that we think would be important to do at this juncture. One, we agree with the UN Special Rapporteur that Iran's actions may constitute crimes against humanity. We're talking about murder, imprisonment, enforced disappearances, torture, rape, and sexual violence. We urge the U.S. government to support the efforts of the UN's independent international fact-finding mission on Iran, and we also support a UN Security Council referral of the matter of Iran to the International Criminal Court. In addition, we look to Congress to reauthorize the Lautenberg Amendment, which allows for family reunifications in the United States. And finally, just in general, we need to keep the focus on Iran and what it's doing to its own people, particularly in the context of religious freedom and belief.
Well, Susie, thank you for shining the spotlight on it this evening. We appreciate you coming on. Susie Gelman with USERF. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be right back. Welcome back. The fight over censorship in schools spilled into the halls of Congress today. Republicans arguing for the banning of some books, highlighting the explicit nature of some books available to children in schools and libraries.
This is not a ban. This is about schools deciding what's appropriate for school children. And sexually explicit, obscene, pornographic material isn't appropriate, and many parents are legitimately concerned about that.
Democrats argue censoring books limits liberty and literature.
I am suspect of these books being taken out of libraries and schools because I started seeing books that had been there not just for years, but for decades, literally generations, 25, 30, 40-year-old books on shelves suddenly being taken off.
Democrat Senator Cory Booker adding that Congress has little, if any, role in a debate over censorship in schools, adding, quote, "We will make no laws addressing this." Well, whether it is book bans or shouting down opponents in the public square or on social media, some say so-called cancel culture has gone too far, causing free speech and America as we know it to come under attack. Jennifer Wishon explains.
In America, even the most vile speech is protected. It's one of the first guarantees the founders bestowed upon American citizens in the Bill of Rights. Today, however, through censorship, banning books, and the new art of heckling speakers into silence, free speech is under attack like never before. So
what is going on here? I mean, what is the fear of having different ideas out there?
If you can deny citizens the opportunity to hear the truth, to challenge falsehood and lies, you can imprison people, not physically necessarily, but in a prison of lies and falsehoods. And that's one of the most profound forms of unfreedom that any human can experience, is living a life of lies.
As Senior Vice President of Alliance Defending Freedom, Ryan Bangert has a front row seat to the anti-free speech movement. He says it's speeding up and spreading to other sectors of the economy, like banking.
Take, for instance, my own organization, Alliance Defending Freedom. Fidelity Charitable made it more difficult for donors to give to ADF through their DAF accounts, simply because we are a religious freedom organization.
There are calls from both sides of the aisle to ban certain books many people find offensive, a practice some liken to the burning of books in Nazi Germany. Others celebrate efforts by social media companies to censor hateful speech, silence so-called misinformation, and ban people's accounts. The problem is everyone's threshold of what's hateful or dangerous is different, and sometimes misinformation turns out to be true. This spring, the president of West Texas A&M University canceled a student-organized drag show citing his religious beliefs, calling such shows derisive, divisive, and demoralizing misogyny. And even if you agree, critics warn a university president's personal beliefs can't be the standard. If that's the case, then student-led prayer could be next. Some calls for censorship and stifling of speech come from the very institutions designed to protect them. take a bill passed by the House designed to prevent domestic terrorism after a shooting at a supermarket in New York. Critics argue the legislation could enable the Justice Department to target parents who disagree with their school boards. Jonathan Turley, law professor at the George Washington School of Law and constitutional scholar, testified against the bill.
Fortunately, even though we live in dangerous times, we have a Constitution designed for bad times, not good times. Indeed, the Constitution was written in the worst of times.
He points out similar laws already exist in Europe. Turley points to England, where he writes even a silent prayer is a criminal offense when done near an abortion clinic, and points to a European man recently convicted of a thought crime. The neo-Nazi was given a 4-year sentence for what the court called his toxic ideology, based on the contents of the home he shared with his mother, and continues, while most of us find Brock's views repellent and hateful, they were confined to his head and his room. At the World Economic Forum in January, the vice president of the European Commission predicted European hate speech laws will soon be the law of the land in the U.S.
Because what qualifies as hate speech, as illegal hate speech, which you will have soon also in the U.S., I think that we have a strong reason why we have this in the criminal law.
Some scholars warn Americans can't assume the Constitution is indestructible.
Persons of certain faiths or beliefs, increasingly Christians, but also those of other faiths, are being frozen out of the marketplace simply because of the ideas they hold. And that is profoundly wrong. It's un-American. It's also contrary to the principles of the free market.
Even the founders disagreed at times over how the First Amendment should be applied. And while different opinions will persist, many people say it's important to preserve this freedom deemed central to being American. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
Finally tonight, with great power comes great responsibility. And one Detroit man is taking his responsibility to the city's next generation seriously. Kier Gibson loves Spider-Man, whose stunts helped inspire him to get into parkour. Now a parkour instructor, Gibson hopes his work keeps the next generation off the streets.
It'll keep them off the streets. It'll keep them from doing the things that they're not supposed to be doing. It'll also enhance their learning and strengthen them in the physical body and strengthen them in the mental mind.
Gibson's dream is to open a parkour gym in his community. Have a great night.